Today, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, and Oxford University Press are delighted to launch the PISA 2025 Science Framework. Together, we all share a mission to improve education worldwide. The OECD works to build better policies for better lives. The OECD's Programme for International Student Assessment was introduced in 2000. Since then, it has become a global initiative that measures 15-year-olds' ability to use their reading, mathematics, and science knowledge and skills to meet real-life challenges in more than 90 countries. The results have helped shape education reform around the world, as countries are keen to learn from each other's success. In 2025, PISA will focus on science. Working with Oxford University Press, a group of experts in science and science education from around the world developed the OECD PISA 2025 Science Framework. At Oxford, we work to offer teachers and learners the best resources to realise their full potential in science, to inspire awe and wonder, to empower and equip the next generation with the skills to tackle the challenges of the future, such as climate change and pollution, and misinformation, and help shape science citizens. Our panel will discuss what the OECD PISA 2025 framework tells us about the future of science education.
Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the launch of the PISA 2025 Science Framework. My name is Fiona Fortis and I work for Oxford University Press as International Product Director in the Education Division. As you've seen in the video, today's event is all about the Science Framework, which has been written by the PISA Science Expert Group, selected for their worldwide science education expertise and managed and supported by Oxford University Press. A key part of the framework is that science educators are not only educating the scientists of the future, but also empowering learners to navigate and play an active role in tackling challenges such as climate change and public health. So, our question today is, how can we shape science citizens? What does the PISA 2025 Science Framework tell us about the future of science education? I'm delighted that some of the minds behind the framework can join us today to discuss what it means for the future. First, we have Andreas Schleicher, Director for Education and Skills at the OECD, who oversees the Programme for International Student Assessment, otherwise known as PISA. He's worked for over 20 years with ministers and education leaders around the world to improve education. In a moment, Andreas will share a brief introduction to the framework. We'll then turn to our panel to hear their reflections on the framework and what it means for science education. Jonathan Osborne is Kamalachari Professor of Science Education Emeritus, Stanford University. Since 2012, Jonathan has been the chair of the Science Expert Group that has been so influential in creating the framework. Peter J. White is Associate Professor in Science and Environmental Education at Deakin University. As chair of the Environmental Science Expert Working Group, Peter and her colleagues have put environmental education at the heart of this framework. Catherine Blundell is Professor of Astrophysics at the University of Oxford. Catherine is a renowned science communicator and has set up a worldwide network of 5 schools-based global JetWatch observatories, which collect data on evolving black hole systems and nova explosions in our galaxy, helping to inspire the next generation of scientists in South Africa, Chile, Australia, and India. We welcome any questions that you may have for our panel, and we will try to get to as many of them today as possible. Please note that audience microphones are muted, so please use the chat box to share your comments and thoughts, and post your questions in the Q&A tab. Our moderators will be available in the chat box to help with any technical issues, should you have any. Now, I'm delighted to hand over to Andreas to give us a short introduction to the framework.
Thank you. my presentation ready for you, but it's a great pleasure to be on this webinar today. What you're going to see is a small revolution in science in PISA. Of course, PISA has always looked at science since the early 2000s, but back then it was mainly students to know specific scientific content. Now in 25, we're going to look a lot more at students' capacity to think like a scientist, to address real-life problems through the application of complex scientific ideas and concepts, to navigate ambiguity. The world is full of science, but some of that is actually quite confusing. Students have to make their own judgments. So you're going to see some ideas playing out of this. Now, we are just coming out of, the pandemic that has shown us the role, the real life impact that science have, both as a problem, but also as a solution when you think about the development of vaccines. And the future is always going to surprise us. Climate change is going to disrupt our lives a lot more than this pandemic, and artificial intelligence, puts a lot of what we do to the test. This modern world no longer just rewards us for what we know in science. Now, Google knows everything. The world rewards us for what we can do with what we know, how we can put our knowledge to practical use. And there are a lot of other kind of trends that shape our future, that shape the future of education. Now, succeeding in this world is about balancing resilience, our capacity to live in a structurally imbalanced world, and fostering sustainability, keeping the world in balance. And the more you think about those two concepts, the more you'll see that science is very much at the heart of this. That brings us, to another concept. One thing is very clear is that, the kind of things that are easy to teach and easy to test have also become easy to digitize and automate. Now, we are seeing a decline in the demand for routine knowledge, routine tasks. Now, science knowledge that we can, store can be retrieved. Now, we're seeing a rise in technology-intensive tasks, and you put the two things together, you get a sense of the future of work. Now, our capacity to manage complex problems, to think critically, to navigate ambiguity. Think about this. The digital world has become the real world for many people. Now, in the past, when I went to school, science was very easy. I could just read what's in the textbook. I believe it's to be true. And then, I could be very successful. Today, you couldn't go on Google and you get, to know a lot of claims about science. But what do you know? How do you know what is true and what is not true? How do you have those kinds of foundations of knowledge? I think that's critically important. Now, look at the wisdom of crowds. We are all our own authors. Everybody has views and opinions. How do you actually distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not? One aspect of this is, the digital navigation capability that young people have. And we tested that in our last PISA round. You can see here on the left side in Singapore, Korea, parts of China, you have at least a majority of students who can distinguish fact from opinion. Navigate complex information, integrate different information sources. But in most countries, actually, young people at age 15 struggle with this. Being bored into the digital world, doesn't mean that you are a digital native who can actually, operate in this world. And I think that's really crucially important. So this is where PISA comes in with its focus on science in 25. It's the 9th edition of PISA, and we're going to have, about 90 countries joining it. It looks not just at science, but mainly at science, but also reading, mathematics, and also interdisciplinary, innovative skills, the capacity of students to learn in the digital world. Many of the tasks in the next round of PISA will actually integrate learning and assessment, no longer see them as separate aspects. So that's really what you're going to see new. And what do we expect of a good science education? First of all, science creates a shared reality for us. And we desperately need that in the world of polarizations in which we live, where basically we see, educational polarization, cultural polarization, economic polarization. And much of this is, created by a world that puts us into parallel universes, based on our limited experiences, this belief in a common science-based reality, the capacity of young people to understand cause and effect, to reason in causal ways is very important, to understand scientific concepts. But it's not enough. We also need to engage with probabilistic thinking. You think about climate change, you think about, a pandemic. This is all about scenarios. It's about understanding, likelihoods. It's about finding signal in noise. It's about assessing credibility of claims now based on probabilities, being open to alternative versions. Science is never about reproducing the established wisdom of our times, but questioning it, building hypotheses. It's very much about critical thinking. It's about human cognition. And then, I want to add one more point here, and I believe it's very important in the world in which we live. It's very easy. You turn on your television, you listen to what they talk about climate change. It's very easy to be disillusioned. But science always creates that scientific optimism, that can-do attitude, that actually we can find answers to the problems of the future, if we work as a community on science. So that's really what we hope to create out of this. And this is not about, a few people that are going to be engineers and scientists in their later lives. This is the foundation that we want to create for every student. That's why we have made this an assessment for all 15-year-olds, not just those who are, enrolled in specific science-related programs. So let me briefly talk you through the competency areas. What we expect from students, first of all, is that they can, explain the world they see around them in scientific terms, that they can recognize, offer, and evaluate explanation for what they see around them. Second, that they can construct and evaluate designs for scientific inquiry. Not do you remember the results of an experiment that a teacher told you, but can you design that experiment? Can you evaluate scientific claims? Can you interpret scientific data? Can you actually, assess its credibility? Very, very important kind of capabilities in the world of today, in this very confusing world in which we live. And then last but not least, what we've really newly added to PISA is the capacity of students to research, to evaluate, to use scientific information for their own decisions. Can you actually develop a scientific view on a global, on a local, on a personal kind of issue? Can you evaluate its credibility? Can you see, sometimes, problems in the scientific arguments? This is the problem. Everybody talks about science, and can you actually navigate this? And then, the context of this obviously is, the biggest challenge of our times, our environment. The capacity of students to make good trade-offs between the present of the future, to see the longer term challenge, and to, mobilize their cognitive, social, and emotional kind of resources. Now, this is not just about becoming passive consumers of science knowledge, but really to develop that agency that's at the heart of this. Distinguishing scientific evidence from misinformation is very important. And some people say, well, that's just digital literacy or media literacy, the kind of data I just showed you. No, it's also requiring really deep understanding of scientific concepts. It requires, epistemic knowledge of the social practice of science. Now, it's not about right or wrong. It's about, building consensus on scientific ideas, putting them up for testing, looking around the next corner. Very, very important. So that's about this new dimension of evaluating scientific information. The environment, a very, very important context here, and what we expect from 15-year-olds in this PISA assessment will be to be able to explain the impact of human interaction with our planet, to make informed decisions for themselves, understanding, the data, the evidence, and then evaluate them, and to bring them to a conclusion for their personal, their social life. And once again, also to bring that scientific optimism, to develop, this understanding that actually science can find answers to problems that we cannot even yet imagine. And that brings me to the last aspect. No, it's not just about the knowledge, the skills. It's also very much about the attitudes, the science identity, the young people's, openness, their engagement with science. their epistemic beliefs, their enjoyment of science, their science self-concept, their science self-efficacy. Do I believe, I can address problems that may be unsurmountable in the moment? Their instrumental motivation. Yeah, I want to engage in the climate agenda. I need to know something about the science underpinning it. I need to understand, the ideas, their environmental awareness, their concern with this, and last but not least, again, their agency. Why is all this important? I must say, I'm a scientist by background. This is important to me personally. And often when I go into science classes, my heart sinks when I see how we teach science like religion. We make people believe in a specific scientific theory. Then we give them lots of exercises to practice the demonstration of that theory. And at the end, we test whether they know the answers that we projected into their question. That actually has nothing to do with the ideas of science, with the kind of concepts I presented to you. But it is what makes, disengages young people with science, what makes science a boring world of formulas and equations that has so little to do with the nature of scientific inquiry. But by having the right metrics, by having the right goalpost, by showing, what science really means, we hope that it will also, translate into instructional practice. Last point I want to make is I'm incredibly grateful to Jonathan and his team actually for putting all of this together. They've worked for years very, very hard to build an understanding of how is science evolving, where is science education today, and to build that bridge in developing the assessment. So with that, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andreas. Fascinating, and we'll dig into it a bit more in a minute. One of the next points I'd like to get to is just getting a reflections from the panel on the framework. Perhaps, Jonathan, we could go to you first. Any of your key takeaways from your experience or on the framework itself?
Well, I think the framework has to be seen as a kind of evolving document. Each time we come around, we look at the previous one and say, what's changed? What do we need to do to improve it, to better measure the competencies that are needed for the current young generation? And I think really the two things that are standing out for those people who are familiar with the existing framework and the changes. First one is the addition of this new competency, because we're very concerned about the fact that students have to, or they meet lots of scientific information. They are not experts. They have to make some kind of assessment or judgment of whether what they're being told is correct or fallacious. And that means the judgment they're involved in is assessing the credibility, and assessing whether something's credible in science requires you to understand something about the nature of science, that its goal is consensus, the consensus is terribly important, and that consensus is achieved over many years by many pieces of work. One paper on its own is not something that you can take as being credible. So there's a lot of aspects of that we are looking to assess as well this time around. And then I think the other aspect of this that is really very significant, given the current concern of youth about climate change in the environment, is the agency in the Anthropocene, which is really a fresh look at what kinds of competencies we need to develop in young people to deal with the challenges that we're all going to face, but they're in particular going to face it in the coming years. And Peter will have more to say about that. So other than that, I think as Andreas has mentioned, there is the change from attitudes to the concept of identity. And there are some minor improvements, I think, in terms of the epistemic knowledge, the content knowledge, and the procedural knowledge. But that, I think, is the main standout.
Thank you, Jonathan. Peter, over to you for your reflections.
Yes, thank you, Fiona. So our role in education is to prepare citizens to be ready and capable of making decisions and taking responsibility to manage ourselves to regenerate ecological integrity. We must ensure that curriculum is designed in ways that empower teachers to engage their students in learning and develop resilience for a future that is unpredictable in many ways and yet frighteningly predictable in others. This means citizens who understand the science enough to interpret information and assess evidence when making decisions, such as who to vote for or what to consume and when, or how to live meaningful lives. The 2025 PISA Science Framework has been designed with the socio-ecological challenges of the Anthropocene in our minds, and it will assess 15-year-olds in terms of what they know and can do. This data enables greater insight into how we can further transform our education systems to support our future citizenry to make better decisions. But more than that, this framework provides the leverage for science education curriculum writers internationally to be bold and brave now as they implement change in education systems and curricula. The change must respond to the crises of the Anthropocene, enabling us all to develop agency for better decision making and action taking. Teachers need the curriculum mandate as well as the support and resources to then engage their students in learning about how our human-induced crises are occurring. The future of science education is in our hands, and this framework empowers us to start making the necessary changes to how we educate and activate our young people for the futures they now must live in.
Thank you, PISA.
Thanks, Fiona.
Catherine, over to you for your reflections on the framework.
Thank you, Fiona. Well, I'd like to begin by saying that I really salute all of the work done by so many people towards setting up the PISA Science Framework. I think it's brilliant. I think that wearing my hat as a science researcher, I also think that wearing my hat as a human inhabitant of this planet, where, as the previous speakers have said, we face so many challenges in the coming years. Equipping teenagers to be able to ask really good questions is a key first step to becoming a scientist. Being able to change our minds in the light of new information is a key skill in becoming a scientist. And I think that one of the wonderful things that the PISA Science Framework offers is the ability to assess and thereby give confidence to 15-year-olds that they have got confidence, competence, and that they deserve to have confidence in their skills and abilities as they grow into becoming scientists. With all the challenges that we face today, I think it's so important that we move from the current state of scientists being somewhat in a box, separated from the rest of humanity. That's a completely false dichotomy. We need to improve science education across all of humanity so that everybody can ask good questions, can critically assess the evidence in front of them, can vote for the right people, can ask the right questions of politicians, and contribute to a better future for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, everyone, for your reflections. One of the things I wanted to pick up, Andreas, from the video was a comment around we aren't developing a framework for future engineers. And one of the things we all read about is a shortage of scientists and engineers. So my first question for the panel, and Jonathan, I'll go to you first for your comment, is shouldn't policymakers be focusing on developing a science education that prepares for future scientists? Your views, Jonathan?
Well, I think that's a fundamentally flawed argument, I'm afraid to say, because basically you can only justify a science education for all if you provide a curriculum that meets the needs of all and not the needs of the minority, and it's less than 10% that actually go on to scientific careers. So you need to do something for the other 90%. And the traditional science education that focuses on preparation of the professional scientist starts from the bottom up with lots of detailed facts, which you can all remember, like Ohm's law, mitosis, meiosis, Krebs cycle, which is of little value to the future citizen. So you have to start from the premise of what matters for the future citizen, and that what matters, and we will all be future citizens. You may, in fact, be an expert in astrophysics, but you don't know anything very much about evolutionary biology. You are a non-expert when it comes to that. And the question is, what kinds of competencies do non-experts need in the world when they're confronted by scientific issues of a whole, and particularly the issue of climate change and sustainably? And recently we've seen the example with pandemics and all the things that arose there. And the focus, I think, of the framework is very much on asking what is needed by the future citizen. The education of the specialist will always be sustained in that sense. There will always be options for the specialists, either pre-15, but in a lot of cases post-15, with things like AP courses, A-levels in that way. So I don't really, it's a bit controversial, but I don't buy that argument.
And Catherine, what are your views on this?
I must admit, I'm thoroughly in favour of increasing and enhancing science education for everyone. Of course, it's absolutely true that only a minority are going to go on and develop specialisms in particular branches of science. But it's my view that everyone all over the planet needs to have confidence in their ability to assess what politicians, what scientists are telling them, to critically assess that, and then to be able to vote accordingly or write into the media accordingly. I absolutely don't think that we should limit science to a small subset of people and then have a scientist class and a non-scientist class. I truly wish that politicians would embrace the importance of science for everyone, for all teenagers across the board. And I'm so thrilled that we heard earlier from Andreas that the PISA science framework is for all 15-year-olds, not just some limited subset. I truly think it's important that the skills of science, the skills of engineering, are what are imparted to everyone. I think where I would very much agree with Jonathan is that it's not about the knowledge being spread out for everyone. Of course, we don't need a world of people who understand the Friedman-Robertson-Walker metric or some eclectic aspects of cosmology. That's not what we need, and that's not what I'm arguing for. But I am arguing for people who have the confidence based on learning something, whether it's biology or whether it's something from maths, the confidence that they can hold lots of ideas in their own head at a time and critically assess them. And this is the key thing, ask good questions. You don't need to know all the answers, but you need to know how to ask questions. And I think science education is what brings that out in almost everyone.
I mean, not to labor a point, but I wonder, Andreas, just for your sort of final view on this point, is there a sense at all that this new direction is compromising the rigor of science?
Well, actually, I think it is increasing the rigor, because actually just piling up, abstract scientific knowledge is not particularly rigorous. It's just voluminous. And I do think by strengthening the depths of scientific thinking, we're actually introducing rigor. When you can think like a scientist, when you can evaluate scientific claims, that's what scientific rigor and scientific ways of working is really very much about. But I also think we should not set up a false dichotomy. The earlier and the more we engage young and interest young people in science by giving them the tools to solve the problems they see around them, the more people are going to be interested to become specialists and scientists later in their lives. So I do think creating a very broad base, making science a subject that you need. It's a survival tool, like literacy was in the 19th century. Now you need to be able to think like a scientist. And if you are, actually, you have many open doors in life, whether you end up as a scientist or whether you just, evaluate the work of scientists as an informed citizen. So I do think, the more we make science interesting, engaging to young people, the more likely we're going to have people who work in STEM and related fields.
Fantastic, thank you, and I couldn't agree more. I think what one of the points that came out of your presentation, Andreas, is about the topic of misinformation. And Jonathan, one of the questions that I have is just about what educators can do to help young people discern fact from fiction. We know there's a lot of information out there, and we know that the media tends to give equal share of voice to deniers as it does to scientists. What more can educators do to help?
Well, this is something we've been focusing on recently in my work, and I think really the three key questions you have to ask about any scientific claim. The first one is you need to look at who's asking it. So this is work done by a colleague of mine, Sam Weinberg. It says basically you open a tab and check out the person who's making the claim. And do they have any conflict of interest? Do they, for instance, work for the tobacco industry, a pharmaceutical company, in that sense? If they pass that test, the next question to ask to some extent is, what is their authority to make this claim? Which means that we have to teach people that just because they're a scientist doesn't mean that they're an expert in all sciences. So what is it that makes somebody an authority on a particular topic in science, and what is the training that a scientist goes to get to that kind of stage? And I don't think that's really explained. And because if they're not an authority, and there have been various examples of this recently, particularly in the pandemic, then again, you should be very dubious about trusting what they have to say. But the third and most important thing is to understand that the primary goal of science is the achievement of consensus. And when that consensus has been achieved, as in the case, I think, very clearly with climate change, then if you want to be the person on the outside questioning the consensus, you really have got to have a very good case. And the question you've got to answer is why your argument is not going down with the scientific community. And I think those kinds of things are not fully explained in science education at the moment. There's too much emphasis on, I think, a kind of broad overview of the nature of science and how science works, whereas there needs to be much more explanation of how science is really a moral community that engages in checking all of its claims by its peers in a whole set of ways, so as an inbuilt error detection mechanism. And that's what makes it a healthy and vital community.
I mean, that opens up the question around generative AI, I think, and the risk that this spawns, a rapid acceleration in terms of misinformation online. And, the research seems to say that people are already struggling. Catherine, I wonder, your views here. Is there a risk that education is too slow to catch up here?
It's my view that education is about teaching skills rather than inserting knowledge. And I think as long as that remains the focus, then we'll be okay. Because I think misinformation is always going to abound. And yes, it seems like there's a whole tsunami of misinformation coming our way. And I think there are good reasons to be concerned. But I think if we have the confidence to ask good questions, if we have the confidence to assess who's giving us this message, is it someone with an axe to grind, perhaps someone from a particular political tribe, or is it someone who does have the domain-specific knowledge to give us an authoritative answer, then I think we can probably cope. But if we don't ever train people to critically assess information in whatever field, they don't stand a chance of being able to apply it in another. Yes, I'm a professor of astrophysics, but I wouldn't dream of making assertions about vaccines. But I have the utmost effect for Sir Chris Whitty, for Dame Sarah Gilbert, and many others in Oxford and beyond, for whom that is their dedicated area of specialism.
Jonathan, do you have a view here regarding the tsunami of misinformation and the role of educators?
Well, I think basically education, like all spheres of activity, is desperately trying to work out what the implications are of generative AI. I think there's, at the moment, my limited experience of it is actually I've tended to see the good rather than the bad, in the sense that generative AI uses large language models, it searches through lots of texts. So if you put into it questions like, is climate change a hoax, it'll very clearly tell you that it's not in that sense. So it uses the consensus of scientific information to provide information. But I'm waiting to see how any technology is always manipulated by people for their own ends. So I'm kind of waiting to see how it will be manipulated in that kind of way. And obviously, I think what you're trying to build in all education, but obviously we're focusing on science education here, is that kind of critical disposition to be wary of, particularly in the current context, because people are deluded into thinking
Thank you for that. Peter, to pull you into the conversation, I kind of thinking more about educators and responsibility. And I wonder if I could put to you whose responsibility you feel it is to raise awareness among learners worldwide about socio-ecological challenge. Is it families? Is it educators? Is it the school? Is it publishers, governments? What is your view?
Well, thanks, Fiona. I think that it's all of our responsibility, really. So, we're working to be clear about what are the challenges, to understand that they're social in their genesis, that we're in a human-induced crises at the moment, or several crises. But in terms of raising awareness, it's really time we move well beyond that. I mean, we don't want to just sit with the understanding that we've got problems that our Western societies are causing. We want to start to take action. That might mean learning how to live differently, learning how to make decisions differently. And that comes back to a very personal thing, something that you might do with your family, that you talk about the decisions that you're making on a daily basis. It might come down to the kind of products that you purchase in our very consumeristic society. So yes, we all share the responsibility, but it must step way beyond awareness raising into taking action and learning how to make decisions based on information, based on a critical evaluation of that information, learning how to be able to assess and make great decisions for not only ourselves, I suppose, but pushing how we frame our thinking well beyond a personal sphere, but understanding that we are part of an ecosystem and all the decisions we make impact all of the ecosystem, including us as one small aspect of it. Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you, Peter. Andreas, over to you. What are your views here in terms of responsibility as well as taking action and agency, and who should be involved and at what levels?
Yeah, I think I agree with Jonathan that, generative artificial intelligence could become a force for good. And actually, it is science that can make it a force for good for people. But I think it comes back to Catherine's point, that what makes us vulnerable to artificial intelligence is our compliance-based way of educating people, where we teach prefabricated answers rather than educating people to question the established wisdom of our times. And the more actually we educate people to ask good questions, to think around the next corner, to have that approach of a scientist to issues. It's about building consensus, but I think it's also about questioning that consensus and testing hypotheses and finding sort of the new ground. And I think the more we have that attitude, the more we can actually use artificial intelligence as a force for good that will help us, understand our own biases, that will help us, integrate knowledge that is very, very hard to digest for humans. So I do think we should look at this as a policy. But clearly, there is a race between technology and education. Technology is racing ahead at breathtaking speed, and education has a hard time to adapt its practices. And that's really, I think, what this science framework is about. It is meant to be a tool, not just to design our next PISA test, but also to provide orientation. What matters in science? What are the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes, and values that actually matter in this world? And I do think if we do a good job in science education, I think we will prepare people to live with those new technologies.
Absolutely. And I wonder, just to kind of elaborate on that point, Andreas, what you see the implications are in terms of changes to teacher training, etc., in relation to the PISA framework.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very, very good question. Obviously a framework and even a curriculum, the next step is to translate a framework like this into the what question. What should we be teaching 15-year-olds? That's only the starting point. The bigger question is how you design learning environments that enable that. And in this world, you don't want to teach students the results of an experiment. You want to give them the tools to conduct that experiment, to design it, to evaluate it. And I think those learning environments are going to be the crux on this. And what it also means is that in science, sometimes we achieve more by teaching fewer things at greater depths, rather than to rushing through, a 1,000-page textbook, giving students a few exercises where they develop a deep understanding of a scientific idea, of a scientific concept. So I think that requires a lot of ingenuity on the part of educators. Also, the capacity to have that space to prioritize steps of understanding. And I think where we do that, we will achieve good results. And for me, I think an important product also is really the engagement of young people. Again, we want that. We need everybody in this game. Everybody needs to be motivated by science. Everybody needs to develop that sense of inquiry. And I think captivating young people with tasks that are interesting to them. And this, in a way, goes beyond science. When I think about learning environments, I think it's the broader STEM area. Now, the technology, the engineering need to come into this. This is where students actually can try things out, develop things, do things. And then I think science becomes something that they learn to apply and to use in a real world context.
Absolutely. I wonder, Catherine, over to you, if you can think of any examples where science education is really working to help shape science citizens, to talk to the theme of the webinar.
So my work, my research, my worldwide telescopes take me to a number of different countries around the world. And in fact, just 48 hours ago, I was in Chile at my school there. And I'm so impressed at the jobs done by teachers. And what makes science education work is the heart that teachers have to share their knowledge, their skills, their ability to learn new things with their students. And that's key. And so anything that we do to support teachers is a really fabulous investment, because it will have payoff repeatedly throughout successive school years. In terms of my own activities, I've observed so many times that when teenagers are having fun, they're in a place where they can learn. I do that myself with sharing my telescopes with school students. And learning new things is exciting. Learning new things brings joy. And I think, although I've emphasized earlier the importance of learning skills, I would very much echo what Andreas said earlier about learning a smaller number of things in greater depth and greater detail. The satisfaction of understanding something is tremendous and terrific. And the more that we can share that with students, teenagers around the world, the better. There is so much intellectual poverty in our world at present. And I think we have to use all the tools in the toolkit. And I do think that the PISA framework is just terrific in terms of setting a really good standard, which will ultimately deliver to these 15-year-olds the confidence to say, you're doing well, you're on the right track, carry on with the journey of becoming a scientist.
Absolutely. Talking to the framework specifically once again, Andreas, do you see an evaluation yet of how a country's specific education curricula will need to adjust in response to the new direction of the PISA framework?
Yeah, we have actually studied national curricula quite extensively over many years, and the answer varies really by countries. Some countries are actually very advanced in this, looking at competency-based approach to science teaching, looking at applied science learning. In others, the emphasis is still very much on the accumulation of scientific knowledge. The extent to which the different science areas are integrated varies. Some countries teach science, some countries teach physics, chemistry separately. So I do think the answer varies a lot. What encourages me, and I really think the science group, Jonathan and his group, what their real achievement is not just to put together a paper, but to build a global consensus on this. The fact that we have close to 100 countries around the world basically at least agreeing with this as a shared vision. Many are still very skeptical. How do we put that into classrooms? How do we actually make that work? I take all of that. But the fact that you now have a very large group of countries globally who embark on this and using this as the metric of success, to me, I think is a remarkable development that over time, will probably influence curriculum development in many countries in the way PISA has done so in the past.
Absolutely. And Andreas, are there specific implications that you can see for the developing world or the global South?
Well, I think this agenda may matter even more to countries in the global South, and also the approach that the PISA framework takes makes it actually easier for many of the countries to embark on this journey, because the approach that we have in the global North is very much on, a specialist education. It's very much on you need to first know a lot in chemistry and physics and biology before we start to engage you in scientific thinking. And I do think countries that start from a different angle probably will find it easier to develop, real science engagement, real scientific competency from this. But, time will tell. We will see when we get the results on how they look in different places.
Absolutely. Coming back to the theme of agency and the climate, Peter, I wondered what your reflections were in terms of the timing. So this will be the first PISA assessment focused on science since the wave of youth activism swept the world in terms of things like School Strike for Climate. What does it mean for learners' attitudes to science, education, and the environment?
Well, I think the School Strike for Climate was a clear demonstration that our young people have a very strong desire to know what's going on in their world. They appreciate that we're in times of crises, that the socio-ecological challenges that we're facing are complex, they're hard to understand. And from my research with young people, it's not that they need to know the science. In fact, often they're more interested in the social justice aspects that the crises are revealing. So I guess it's important for us to think about how do we support our young people to be able to get the kind of knowledge and education, thinking about skills and competencies to make decisions into the future that are supportive of them being able to live as competent citizens in the future.
Yeah, if I may just come into this. Actually, we did look into this in an earlier PISA assessment, and actually the science was an important predictor. What we could see is actually that young people who lacked a scientific understanding often had a quite naive scientific optimism. Oh, well, some politician is going to come along and solve all of this. I don't need to change my behavior. Students with a deeper scientific understanding actually were much more realistic and much more engaged in actually addressing the issue. So I think we need to get both things right, develop a good understanding of the issues that creates that realism and that sense of commitment and engagement, and at the same time, the motivational aspect. And even in 2000, in the earlier assessments, 2015, we had actually a pretty good level of student awareness of environmental issues. What they lacked often was that sense of agency. What I do is going to make a difference to people in other places, and I can actually contribute to this. So again, that shows that we shouldn't make students passive consumers of stuff, but really give them a sense of agency. And again, in a good science education, in my view, is one of the best investments we can make in the future of this planet.
You brought up agency once again, so I wonder, Peter, for your views really about the implications of a focus on agency and decision-making as part of science education.
I think it's key. I think when you're educating others about science, it's important to bring in the local context, to be able to share and empower your learners to appreciate that they are decision makers, but that there are multiple perspectives on any issue that's unfolding in a local context. So, supporting students to be able to appreciate the different perspectives, understand where they come from, use their skills to analyze and critique the information that supports or not each perspective. So the idea of having agency to work through that decision-making process is clearly key here. But agency isn't only an independent skill. It's also something that we might work on in collaboration with others. So those communication skills, our collaboration skills, our ways of being able to work with others are part of being having great science education and science practice. It's broadening into understanding, learning the content and the concepts, but in a way that allows us to communicate and collaborate with others.
And I wondered about teaching for hope and teaching for agency. How do you do that without generating stress and anxiety?
Well, I'm not convinced that we can do it without having anxiety, and perhaps we should be very anxious about the situation that we're all in right now. Of course, we don't want to increase those feelings in an unsupported way for our young people. It's important that we build into our education practices opportunities for young people to speak about their concerns, to share their thoughts and feelings about the local context, the global contexts. And we do that in an education setting by creating opportunities, working through scenarios, speaking with our colleagues, bringing in new information, exploring it, judging its accuracy and reliability, and then using that to make decisions and taking action to move forward. So one way of generating a hopefulness in a group of young people is to support them to be taking action on local or global issues, what's relevant to them, enabling them to be able to speak back to decision makers, to have the information to share with their community in meaningful ways that will enable themselves and their communities and their families to make change decisions.
Absolutely. And before we move on to questions from our participants, I wonder if we can just conclude this section, Andreas, with a few quite practical questions, which are just around what happens next? How will curriculums change? How will school systems be made aware of the new framework? And what's the timescale for systems to put this into place?
Well, here we are just talking about the international assessment. So the next step for us is to develop a really good set of instruments that brings that framework to life, and we are on a good process with that. So that we have, assessment instruments that make those ideas of the framework visible, tangible, measurable, and internationally comparable. And I think that's something that is the promise of PISA, and that will happen by 2025. The run-on effect on curricula is often indirect. Countries are looking at this framework, they will share it with their national experts, and then those people will discuss it, and that will influence countries then to sort of see, oh, well, we want to incorporate some of ideas into national curricula. That's not, in the remit of PISA, that's really a responsibility of countries. What we do, and I saw an earlier question in the chat on this, we help countries with item development workshops. How do you develop a task that measures those concepts? It's often, PISA is very, very different from what you might remember from school as a multiple choice test. It really looks at, assessing students' ways of thinking. It gives them choices. It gives them tasks to do, to design an experiment rather than just to find, the right answer and so on. So that's our job. That's going to happen. 25 is the time when we assess it. There is the, indirect effect before countries will, make adaptations. But there's certainly, when the results come out, a big discussion, as there's always been on PISA, when people find the results, how did they work out across, geography, across gender, across social background, across, lots of factors. And I think the debate, I think will very much relate to that.
Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who has participated by putting their questions in the chat. We'll do our best to get through as many of them as possible. One of the questions that I thought might spark an interesting conversation is just about the focus on environmental education, which has been a key part of our discussion today and is obviously a key part of the framework. So the question here is about why. Why are we foregrounding environmental science in the new framework? There are many difficult problems that the world's facing: poverty, illness, the rise of AI on top of environmental problems. So shouldn't science aim at equipping our students with the knowledge and skills to aim at addressing all these problems? I do appreciate the importance of environmental science, but also wonder if we might have subtly overemphasized a specific problem faced globally. Like to hear the panelists' thoughts. So perhaps, Jonathan, we could start with your views.
Yeah, well, I would urge people to read the framework. I mean, there are really two documents. There is the framework document, which is setting out what the goals and outcomes and aspirations of the science education might be. And that, rather, as Andreas said beforehand, that's has value, obviously, in terms of determining what it's going to assess, but I think it also has value in setting out a vision for what a contemporary science education should be. So as a policy document, I think it's valuable in that way. And what it's saying as a policy document is that many of these aspects of science essentially are important, and that the environmental component is particularly important in that way as well. And we are honest and frank about it, because if you look at the other document, it has more in it than is in the science document. And we cannot, in the science framework, in the cognitive questionnaire and in the non-cognitive questionnaire, assess all of the things that are set out in the agency in the Anthropocene document. What we're trying to do is give some kind of measure of that. We're not saying that this is what all science education is about. We're saying this is an important element. We want to get some kind of measure of that. I think you've got to look at the agency in the Anthropocene document as well as also being a policy document, as making a coherent argument for why this matters, what are the kinds of opportunities you should be trying to develop in order to help young people confronted by the challenges that we have today. Yes, there are other challenges, but these contribute. I think if you put it, say it's all specifically about climate change, it's not. It's much more about than that. It's about sustainability. It's about where do we get the resources, where do we get the food, where do we get the clean water, all these kinds of things, which are the major challenges we face as humanity. So I think read the documents, I think, as well.
Peter, your views?
Well, I take Jonathan's final point there. Yes, we use climate change as a key crisis that we can talk about because it's a classic socio-ecological challenge. It's generated by humans. We've created this situation, and to move forward, we're going to have to work out ways how to change our behavior and how to plan for a different future. Of course, science has a key role to play in how we're going to move forward. I think too, as Jonathan said, it's not just climate change. There are multiple crises unfolding. We could talk about biodiversity loss. That brings us to how we generate our food systems. There are some very significant challenges with biodiversity loss, many that we don't even appreciate at this point in time. And so it's of course more than just climate change, but the importance is that we're thinking about how we as humans in our social systems are impacting our earth systems. And that's a very significant and a really serious issue, a challenge situation that we find ourselves in. So to understand it is the first part of learning how to make decisions to take ourselves out of being in that situation.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And you mentioned social systems, and I'll go on to another question that talks a bit about societal beliefs here. And Andreas, perhaps you could pick up on this one initially. The question is, if science attitudes and knowledge are the responsibility of all of us, how much might PISA be a measure of societal beliefs and norms in a country, as well as its formal and informal education program?
Well, I think, education is always a whole of society product. And certainly, beliefs, norms, the commitment, the value that education has in a society plays into those results. What PISA does, and it looks at the outcome at the end of this. And I actually think that's something that we should perhaps more consciously leverage, that we provide more learning opportunities for young people out of school, that they have more opportunities to engage with questions on, for example, the environment. And to your earlier question, Fiona, I think one of the mistakes that we make in current science education is that we have this idea we need to prepare students for all eventualities that they might face in their lives, and therefore we have to, put them a mile wide but just inch deep science education to them. That we give some more emphasis on sustainability here is just one of the contexts. The framework is about scientific ways of thinking and engagement, and we just need to find contexts that actually interest students, that engage them. I'm sure Catherine might say, well, why not astrophysics? But that will just speak to a very small share of young people, and so take it as a context. Sustainability is the biggest challenge of our times. Young people, are aware of it. Let's give them the tools to deal with this. And then when they have those tools, they can actually extrapolate and apply them in novel situations that we might not even imagine today. So that's the way I would look at that.
And we talked a lot about skills, and the framework's called the science framework, but the question in the chat is about, should in fact we call it a skills framework, recognizing that young people have to develop these skills and competencies?
Well, I'll answer that one very quickly, which is the whole of the PISA framework is based on the notion of competencies, not skills. You will not find the word skill used in there because it's an ambiguous word. There are very few things that are pure skills. Competencies require the ability to do something which is acquired through practice and the knowledge. So it's both of those in combined, which is why they are specifically called competencies. And there's a document that sets that out going back to 2003. And it's the same thing in the American system, which defines outcomes in terms of performance expectations, what students can do with the knowledge. And I think this goes back to earlier points about what we're interested in is essentially what students are capable of doing with the knowledge, and that giving them the opportunity to do that also helps to build the knowledge. But Andreas might have something to add to that.
No, absolutely. I think what we often see is a quite false dichotomy between knowledge and skills. Competency is about our capacity to mobilize the knowledge, skills, the attitudes and values, and bringing that together, to putting it to use. And that's really the heart of this framework. And clearly, knowledge has a very important role. You can only develop competency if you know something, but the question is, is the kind of motivation behind of this, and this is really competency.
Catherine, what are your views?
I very much agree that knowledge matters. I of course agree with the need for actual competence, and I think that does come about through developing skills. I think it's really important to keep in mind though, and while I very much agree with Andreas that I wouldn't dream of saying astrophysics is the preeminent thing on that should be on anyone's curriculum, of course I wouldn't dream of that, but it can give a perspective to the problems that we face on this planet. But context is everything for developing a firm and secure knowledge base, for building those important foundations. So I'm a big fan of the PISA science framework. I look forward to 2025.
Can I just add to that, though, which is I really don't think we should lose sight of the fact that actually one of the core missions of science education is to introduce students to ideas that are simply transformative. So in the case of astrophysics, the idea that you live on a tiny planet circulating what is actually a star, which is part of thousands of millions of stars, and which there are many more thousands of millions, that is simply awesome. And there are many more ideas like that. And that is a responsibility of science education. And I think that sometimes gets lost, and might have got lost in our conversation today. And that is something that we still wish to see in that form.
Absolutely agree. The awe and wonder aspect should never be forgotten. To bring it a bit back down to earth, and Catherine, I wonder if I can go back to you for this question, which was around, and I'm just trying to find the question in the chat. It was around application of the framework in rural communities. and how, and perhaps Andreas, you may have views here too, about how we can help educators develop scientific inquiry skills in children in such places.
I think it's really important that the rural communities don't get left out. One of my telescopes is in rural southern India, and they're doing their bit. They've got a wonderful campaign called Go Green Before Green Goes. And I have every confidence that they'll be very receptive towards the PISA science framework. Absolutely, the rural communities matter for all sorts of reasons, not just their own intrinsic human worth, but we have got to change behaviour all over the planet. So big tick against the rural schools.
Andreas, would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think that's also where big challenges lie, because that's not just about what happens in the classroom, but it's about the context that young people see. If you've never met a scientist, why would you, get interested in science? And sort of to see in your environment, in your context, the application of those knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values is crucially important. It's not so much a matter of, urban rural, but it's really about making that real for young people, making them see that and bringing them together with people who are enthusiastic about science, who work in those fields.
Super. Thank you so much. There's a question here about asking about the link between the framework for mathematics and the framework of science. Jonathan, perhaps you'd like to answer?
Yes, I'm not going to give you a very good answer because I think they are framework for mathematics is developed by a separate expert group, and to be honest, we're aware of what they do, but that's not a preeminent consideration when we come to it. Whether there should be more relationship is an interesting question, but Andreas, you might have more of a view about this.
Yeah, I think the approach is actually very similar in mathematics. So we are talking less about, the capacity of students, to remember formulas and equations. We look at, can they understand the idea, the concept of an exponential function and apply it to the expansion of a pandemic or, climate change. So it's very similar. We talk about big ideas, concepts. We give students problems from the real world. We require them to be able to translate the real world problem into this world of mathematics and then use mathematics to solve the problem and interpret the results back in the original problem context. So that's actually quite similar to the approach in science. But obviously, the ideas in mathematics are different ones. But the approach to assessment is actually quite similar.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Jonathan. There's a question here which comments that they're very happy to hear about the evolution of the test. Will science identity be part of the main test or optional survey of participants? Andreas, perhaps for you?
Yeah, no, it's an integral part of the PISA assessment because we believe it's an integral part of, science competency. Your views on yourself, your self-concept and all of those aspects, self-efficacy. Are you going to tackle problems even if they look very difficult to you? So we believe it's an integral part. So that's going to be then maybe one or the other country that choose not to ask one or two questions. That's always the case. But we look at that contextual information as a very central part of the PISA assessment.
Thank you. And it could be related. Another question asks about the background questionnaire. And the question is, what improvements have been made to enhance our understanding of science teaching and learning activities experienced by students?
Okay.
Yeah, the main development. Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Well, yeah. The first thing to understand about the background questionnaire, the non-cognitive questionnaire, is that it wants to get much more data than it possibly can in the time. So there are always kinds of compromises to be made in terms of what's in and what's out from that point of view. And there was some controversy, I think, last time about what was measured. And I think what we have done this time, because we've contributed to the development of the bits that measures science teaching practices, is try and sharpen those up so that the questions are clearer and less ambiguous from that point of view, so that we will get better data on which we can report. Because ultimately the kinds of quality of the findings depends upon the quality of the data. And that's what we've been trying to do. But Andreas, you might want to add something.
No, I think that's exactly how things work. And we're also trying to capture a bit better, the real learning experiences that students have. In the past, we didn't have the instruments for that, but now I think students, we can ask them questions about the learning environments they experience, the pedagogical practice, and so I think we're going to get a lot more interesting data on those aspects.
We've got a question here, and Andreas, perhaps to you first, which is about how PISA will respond to AI in 2025.
Yeah, we have actually a special component on that where we more or less integrate the learning and the assessment part. So normally, you ask students to pile up years and years and years of knowledge, and then one day you pull them back and say, well, tell me everything that you learned in a very contrived, constrained setting, and we call that a test. And in this 25 assessment, we use the power of AI actually to integrate learning and assessment. So students do exercises, and then they see, have access to an online tutor, because that's what you would do in the real world, where you can actually access external information. I must say that's still something we're experimenting with. This is the component called learning in the digital world, we need to see that those tools really work on a large scale in many countries. That's still in the years ahead. The other part of AI is, the what question. What should we learn to be ready in this world of AI? And that's where I do believe this PISA science framework is actually positioning PISA really well, because it does not, look at the kind of knowledge and skills that AI, does better than humans. It looks really at the complementarity of human and artificial intelligence. I think sort of on the what question, I think PISA is well aligned with the development of AI. And, for the OECD, this AI development, generative artificial intelligence, has not been much of a surprise. We've been tracking those developments since 2016 and look at the AI capabilities. So we've been anticipating much of that in the development and design of PISA.
Thank you. The question I have here is around connecting with the PISA results. So the question is, as PISA is a systemic measure, it can be quite difficult for practitioners to connect with the results. What is the best way for teachers to learn from PISA?
Well, again, I would start with the framework. Absolutely, the results will be about your system. It's going to be very hard for teachers to directly relate the results they see to their classrooms. But, you can look at the frameworks, the type of questions that PISA asks. You can ask yourself as a teacher, in my country, what are the type of questions students are really good at, and where do they struggle? Because those are usually features of, teaching practices. And I do believe that level of engagement is very, very helpful. And beyond that, we do actually offer also what we call a PISA for Schools assessment that actually gives schools individual results. But I actually would say the main benefit teachers have is really by engaging with the framework, the nature of the questions that are being asked, and then to sort of see how they can use and apply that in their own instructional setting.
Thank you. Peter, perhaps I could ask you to comment on the next question. The question says, I'm curious on whether the implications of science education on young people's awareness of humanitarianism, if any, would be measured in the PISA 2025 science framework.
Well, I probably should throw that back to Andreas, but no. Yes, when we analyze the data, we might be able to draw conclusions, but it's not the direct link of why we're asking, setting the framework in the way that we have. One of the things that you will notice when you read Agents in the Anthropocene or look at the elements of the science framework are that we're encouraging science educators to set science in a very social context. And I think that's an important step for science education, to look at how our society really impacts or is impacted by science, a two-way consideration.
Andreas, would you concur with the question regarding humanitarianism?
Yeah, absolutely. But in 2018, we gave that aspect actually quite some emphasis in PISA. You know, if you drink a cup of coffee in Oxford, do you understand the implications that could have, you know, for coffee workers in Colombia and things like this? So to what extent are young people aware of the interconnectedness? To what extent do they show empathy? To what extent are they open to different ways of thinking, different ways of walking, appreciate different cultures and traditions? So that was actually a quite important emphasis in 2018. So we know quite a bit about that already now.
Fantastic. And Peter, another question here is regarding the term agency in the Anthropocene. The question is this related to the carving of this term within the framework of assessing science, as it's an uncommon term? What does the concept raise? How can it have an impact on students' knowledge? Understanding the term can be difficult to translate.
Yes, no, we definitely had lots of conversations amongst our team about the term, and it was a very conscious decision to use the word Anthropocene in naming the document. And we hope that some of that difficulty that readers might find in reading the term and understanding what it means encourages them to dig into further reading about, well, what does the Anthropocene mean? What are the social implications for the way we find ourselves in these situations? In very short term, Anthropocene reflects the human impact on our Earth systems, which, as you can see when you look at the framework, the science framework, it's clearly one of the key competencies is understanding Earth systems. So the use of that language was intentional. And it was also intentional to focus towards agency being something that's a step well beyond just understanding. So we wanted to move beyond awareness. We also wanted to broaden beyond the ideas of sustainability. Often in schools, we see sustainability done in very traditional ways. It might be revegetation, it might be waste management, it might be energy conservation. And so we wanted to really complexify and represent the complexity of the situation that we're in globally in the term and in how we framed the competencies of agency in the Anthropocene. So I really encourage people to have a read. We've tried to write the document in a way that draws people in to appreciating the history of the field of environmental education and education for sustainability, and then appreciating our current context really does give new emphasis and new urgency to how we can take up these concepts through science education.
Thank you, Peter. I think a final question before I'll turn to concluding remarks from the panel. This question states, the new emphasis in science education sounds important and necessary, and also like a shift towards an interdisciplinary approach involving science teachers in building efficacy, awareness of political systems, strategies for action taking. Does the panel have suggestions for how to convince teachers to make this shift? And I think perhaps I'll start with you, Catherine, and then perhaps we can take it as views from around the room.
I think we should avoid telling teachers they've got something else to add to their to-do list. Many of the teachers whom I encounter around the world are working so hard. They're dealing with the nurturing of teenagers freshly out of a pandemic that has hit us in a way that is unfamiliar to everyone living at the current time, I think. I think the key word is supporting teachers and helping them and giving them things along the path that make it easier for them to do the job that they need to do.
Agreed. Jonathan, would you say it is the framework is a shift towards an interdisciplinary approach?
I wouldn't call it interdisciplinary in a strong way. I think it's broadened some of the things that it now incorporates and looks at, but I wouldn't call it interdisciplinary. I think that the poignant answer to anybody who's doubting that is to say, well, actually, what matters at the end in the science classroom is the interest and engagement of the students. And the students are engaged when they can see what the relevance is of what they're learning to their own lives and why it might be important. So if science is presented in a social context where the current problems are discussed, where some of the understanding of how we came to know some of these things, then it starts to be engaging. And I think it helps to get away from what might, for many students, can seem like a dry delivery of incessant facts. So I think there's a strong case for adding this element in the teaching of science. But I appreciate the point. We don't want to add more to teachers' plates, but I think it's more about doing the same thing, just giving a context to make it more meaningful.
And Peter, perhaps to you, I mean, there was a line here around strategies for action taking. I assume that is something that has been included.
Yes, definitely. There are quite a few ideas in the support document around what agency in the Anthropocene might look like. And we've even given an example about the dingo in Australia as a stepped out, worked example of what agency in the Anthropocene might look like in PISA. And I think if you were to look at that example, you could then consider what your classroom activities might look like. But I think, Fiona, I'd like to also talk about the question that came before and talk about our teachers, because I really do feel strongly about ways to encourage our teachers. First of all, I don't know that many of them need much encouragement at all. They're looking for the permission, the curriculum support to strongly step into supporting their young people to understand the context in which we all live. We're all facing uncertain futures. We all want to understand and appreciate better decision-making strategies and better ways forward. So the PISA science framework gives curriculum writers that opportunity to change what's in the curriculum, which is the ultimate permission, the mandate for teachers to design their classroom practices. Beyond that, of course, we all need to keep learning about the context, the local and the global, and find ways of resourcing and supporting classroom activities and action.
Thank you so much. Andreas, over to you for any concluding remarks before I close off.
No, I very much agree with the answers. Teachers are generally enthusiastic. We have to give them more space to, rather than crowd out their time, actually to do fewer things with a level of depth to design innovative learning environments that enable those capacities. And if they get students interested and motivated, their work will be a lot easier. So I actually think that there are many potential synergies. We just need to support a good learning environment for that.
Thank you. And thank you everyone who's joined us for this really special launch event for the PISA 2025 Science Framework, and for all your wonderful questions. Very special thanks to our panelists today, Andreas Schleicher, Jonathan Osborne, Peter White, and Catherine Blundell. To let everyone know who's watched that a recording of the event will be made available shortly for sharing more widely with your networks. You'll have seen links in the chat to explore the framework in more detail, and I would strongly urge you to do that to really ground the experience of this webinar. We also encourage you to discover more about what OUP is doing to help teachers and policymakers around the world shape science citizens. Thank you and goodbye.